In a letter to Pascal Covici dated from 1941, John Steinbeck describes the log from the Sea of Cortez as a whole new approach to thinking. Indeed, as Woodburn or Ross points out, John Steinbeck has succeeded in taking the materials which undermined the religious faith of the 19th century, that is to say, naturalism and science, and fusing them with a religious attitude in the 20th. Jackson J. Benson tells us that Steinbeck was born and reared a romantic, nourished in a climate that was thoroughly unscientific in its approach to life. However, after he met the biologist Ed Ricketts, Benson argues Steinbeck's fictions became less romanticized and a more realistic fiction based on experience, rendered from a naturalistic and scientific perspective, but also following the principles, I believe, established by Zen Buddhism, which states that Buddha took life and the world as they were, and did not try to read them according to his interpretation. Ricketts studied Zen Buddhism avidly, transferring some of that philosophy onto Steinbeck. Essential to Steinbeck's literary development is what Ricketts refers to as breaking through, a term Ricketts developed to explain the Buddhist term satori, which is further explained by D.T. Suzuki as an intuitive looking into the nature of things in contradiction to the analytical or logical understanding of it, and which, according to Eric Tamm Enno, constitutes enlightenment. John Clark Pratt points out that some of our more teleological critics have charged Steinbeck of being an atheist. Like Pratt, I disagree with this assumption. Instead, through the fusion of his Romanticist upbringing with the scientific, non-teleological, and Buddhism-infused thought of Ricketts, Steinbeck manages to make naturalism ancillary to religion in his literature, expropriating naturalism from science and into a religious and mystical realm. More than concerned with a scientific poetic duality, as critic Benson seems to argue, Steinbeck rather creates a religious subtext for his naturalistic literature, which is the core argument of Ross's essay, John Steinbeck, Naturalism's Priest. What I am attempting to establish with this exposition is, first of all, the idea that Steinbeck had a scientific religious relationship with naturalism, and secondly, that he upheld mysticism and religion in a higher pedestal than science. Despite his scientific explanations for non-teleological thinking, in which he even invokes Darwin as the father figure of the philosophy of is thinking, his naturalism resonates with religious and mystic perspective. Even the philosophy of is thinking parallels satori, the previously mentioned religious term from Zen Buddhism. With these ideas established then, I plan to explain a dynamic between Cannery Row and Sweet Thursday in which the author deliberately drives Sweet Thursday to failure in its attempt to debunk a sense of religion and mysticism from the world of the novel Cannery Row, and set in its place a logical and scientific paradigm. To begin my argument, I will attempt to show the mystic and religious environment which is presented in the novel Cannery Row. Cannery Row exposes Steinbeck's appropriation of the principles of naturalism and breaking through into his literature. That is to say, observing things as they are in order to get an understanding of the whole. From the onset, Steinbeck introduces the whole of Cannery Row as a menu of particularities, an amalgamation of different facets which, attempting not to read according to his interpretations, he offers up to be observed through different perspectives. About the inhabitants, for example, the omniscient narrator writes, "Its inhabitants are, as the man once said, whores, pimps, gamblers, and sons of bitches." Had the man looked through another peephole, he might have said, "Saints and angels and martyrs and holy men," and he would have meant the same thing. A dichotomy is created within the prelude. At the forefront, we obtain the Darwinist is thinking, which shows Cannery Row as it is, a poem, a stink, a grating noise, a quality of light, etc. As a background to the naturalistic attempt to describe Cannery Row, we get an allusion to Buddha's teachings. In the comment about the inhabitants of Cannery Row, we are reminded of the principle of not trying to read according to our interpretation. Instead, we are invited to see through different perspectives, through different peepholes. This, I believe, has a touch of the religious rather than the scientific, for the scientific is mainly concerned with what is, while the religious is an attempt to break through. In this case, the ability to detach the self from a particular perspective becomes the breakthrough, again following the principles of Buddha, in that the self is invited to avoid a limited viewing of things through his or her interpretation. Interestingly, the whores, pimps, gamblers, and sons of bitches are elevated to the status of saints and angels and martyrs and holy men, which shows Steinbeck's concern for infusing the mundane world of is with an aura of mysticism, thereby imbuing naturalism with a religious subtext, whether or not the religion is orthodox. The dichotomy presented in the prelude, in my opinion, is a hint as to how the readers should read the novel. Even if the world of Cannery Row seems naturalistic, the reader should be ready to observe underlying religious or mystical connotations. My first impression of the community of Cannery Row was that it works as an ecological system. In the log from the Sea of Cortez, Steinbeck writes in a cosmic perspective that ecology has a synonym, which is all. Cannery Row, in fact, does attempt to assimilate all. The community is not limited to Doc and those who attend his party, but rather extends to include the animals Doc keeps, the dead girl he sees in the tide pool, the Chinaman who walks across the beach every morning, the captain the boys meet, the hundreds of frogs and tomcats the boys catch, and a lonely gopher, among others. The exposition of a diverse community is no doubt Steinbeck's deliberate attempt to show the ecological system through a naturalistic perspective, trying to show the whole as it is. As I have pointed out, however, the importance of the prelude's dichotomy explained above should lead the reader to seek for a mystical and religious counterpart to the scientific and naturalistic world created through the exposition of the community. I disagree with Tom M. Lieber, who writes that John Steinbeck's approach to men seems to be that of a scientist observing and commenting on a group animal. While Steinbeck does portray men as part of ecology with the same basic needs to survive as other animals, seldom does he fail to separate men from other animals by endowing men with the capacity to experience mysticism and to think whether or not he understands what he is experiencing or thinking. Cannery Row offers several instances in which the religious and mystical become a poignant part of the world of the novel. I believe our Western traditional understanding of religion as teleological and often Christianized prevents us from observing the unorthodox sense of religion and mysticism Steinbeck sets upon the naturalistic world he creates in Cannery Row. That we may not observe religion or mysticism in the novel does not necessarily mean that it's not there. I believe the mystic and religious aspects of the novel are necessarily embedded so as to seem naturalistic. In this way, the principles of the Buddhist Satori, looking into the nature of things in contradiction to the analytical or logical understanding of it, is emphasized. Mystical and spiritual moments are just another aspect of the all which constitute Cannery Row. The mystic and religious do not need to be rendered in an analytical or logical manner, but rather as part of nature, a part of the whole. The instances which portray mysticism and religion appear to exemplify breakthroughs. See chapter 4, for example, in which a Chinaman is said to have every day crossed the little beach and disappeared among the piles and steel posts that support the piers, not to be seen again until dawn. This character, whom some people thought was God, gets crossed by Andy, who sings Ching Chong Chinaman sitting on a rail, long came a white man and chopped off his tail. The scene that ensues the insult is a representation of a breakthrough, imbued with a sense of Steinbeck's unorthodox religious and mystical notions. In a letter to Eliza Kazan, which may help us interpret Andy and the Chinaman scene, Steinbeck writes, "Externality is a mirror that reflects back to our mind the world our mind has created of the raw material. But a mirror is a piece of silvered glass. There is a back to it. If you scratch off the silvering, you can see through the mirror to the other worlds on the other side. I know that many people do not want to break through. I do, passionately, hungrily." Andy and the Chinaman scene is presented here. What happened then, Andy was never able either to explain or to forget. For the Chinaman's eyes spread out until there was no Chinaman, and then it was one eye, one huge brown eye as huge as a church door. Andy looked through the shiny transparent door, and through it he saw a lonely countryside, flat for miles but ending in a row of fantastic mountains. There was low, coarse grass on the plain, and here and there a little mound. And a small animal sat on each mound. And the loneliness, the desolate, cold aloneness of the landscape made Andy whimper, because there wasn't anybody at all in the world, and he was left. Andy's ability to look through the shiny, transparent door is no doubt a parallel to seeing through the mirror to the other worlds on the other side. This becomes a breakthrough then, for Andy has seen beyond the external world around him into a different world. If we read the fact that Andy was never able to explain what happened with a religious or mystical connotation, we come to the conclusion that Andy has experienced Satori, the intuitive looking into the nature of things in contradiction to the analytical and logical understanding of it. Unwillingly, Andy has seen the loneliness in the Chinaman's eyes, and he is unable to explain what happened because his vision was intuitive rather than analytical or logical. Worthy of note, too, is the fact that some people think the Chinaman is God. From the onset, the Chinaman exudes a sense of mysticism because that mysticism is perceived by the characters in the story rather than being a projection from the author. Steinbeck decides to allude to a more traditional and orthodox religion at first by mentioning God. Soon enough, however, the more traditional sense of religion and mysticism is replaced by the philosophy of breaking through, as explained already. Though this example captures the essence of the religious attitude Steinbeck affords unto Cannery, I'd like to point out another instance when religion and mysticism are invoked in the sense of breakthroughs and satori. Take, for example, the scene where Doc is having a conversation with Hazel about stink bugs. Doc says, "The remarkable thing isn't that they put their tails up in the air. The real remarkable thing is that we find it remarkable. We can only use ourselves as yardsticks. If we did something as inexplicable and strange, we'd probably be praying. So maybe they're praying." By invoking the term praying, Steinbeck alludes to a tradition from Orthodox religions to invoke a sense of religion for the world of Cannery Row. As usual, however, the traditional religion is debunked if we observe Steinbeck's urge to infuse the naturalistic world of Cannery Row with a sense of Zen Buddhist religion. By saying the real remarkable thing is that we find it remarkable, Steinbeck invokes again Buddha's teachings, observing things as they are and not trying to see them according to our interpretation. Furthermore, Doc seems to have a sort of breakthrough, for his interpretation of the habit of the stink bug is a rather intuitive one than logical or analytical, which constitutes Satori. Steinbeck, through Doc's interpretation, manages to set a religious and mystical background to the is-world of the stink bug. There are several instances in which superstition is alluded to in Cannery Row. In chapter 25, the narrator says, "Cannery Row, like every place else, is not superstitious, but will not walk under a ladder or open an umbrella in a house." And Mary Talbot describes herself and her husband as magic people. While I will not argue that this is religious, it does create an atmosphere of mysticism closely related to breakthroughs. Superstition can be an allusion to Satori in that it is an attempt to understand the world that is through non-analytical, non-logical explanations. Superstitious explanations are rather intuitive, similar to Doc's explanation of the stink bug's habit. In a Darwinist is world, superstition plays an important role in creating a sense of mysticism, for it allows the people to interpret the world through intuition rather than logic. With the above examples, in which the naturalistic world of Cannery Row gets a background of mysticism and religion, I pretended to introduce naturalism and religion not as two distinct elements, but rather as a fused entity, where the mystical and religious are hidden, nevertheless present. Sweet Thursday, contrary to Cannery Row, attempts to undermine the religious, mystical, and at times the naturalistic qualities that we find in Cannery Row by replacing them with a purely scientific perspective and rational conventions of storytelling. Because of these elements, the community of the novel Cannery Row cannot be shown as whole, for it becomes a disjointed community only drawn together again by the return of a sense of mysticism and religion foregrounded by the Darwinist is perspective. The resurgence of mysticism, religion, and naturalism in order to culminate the story with a whole community shows Steinbeck's deliberate attempt to undermine logistics and rationality as a way to find understanding from the whole. Sweet Thursday's scope is limited by its chronological plotline, whereas the plotline for Cannery Row is loose, creating the ability to form a pixelated picture in which each pixel represents a different facets of all. Sweet Thursday's chronological plotline manages to obscure many aspects of the community. The story generates a general direction which we can possibly summarize with: will Doc write the paper? Will Doc get Susie? By having a focus, the story must avoid hoop-de-doodle chapters and other non-action oriented chapters, which chapters are what manage to allow us to see the community of the novel of Cannery Row as the naturalistic and religious all. The chronological plot line becomes a metaphor for logic and reasoning, the idea of going from point A to point B. I believe this to be a synthetic attempt to debunk the idea of Satori, which, as we recall, values the lack of analytical and logical thinking in order to understand the nature of things. Paired with the logistic plotline is the scientific quest Doc undergoes. Doc, whom we have seen explain the habit of the stink bug putting its tail up in the air as praying, now decides to launch a scientific quest in order to analytically and logically show that octopi die with the appearance of apoplexy. While we see Doc conflicted with three voices, the top voice, the analytical, the middle voice, the reproachful, and the bottom voice as emotional, we are invited to see the analytical voice as Doc's preference to solve his problem. Which problem the reader can readily see is loneliness. The narrator says of Doc, these were the answers to his restlessness, peace, and the life of the mind. In contrast to looking at things as they are without personal, logical interpretation, Doc attempts to interpret with analytical thinking the octopi's is world, undermining the mystical observance of things as they are. The life of the mind, the ability to analyze and interpret logically are emphasized by Doc's method of dealing with his restlessness. The brooding for a scientific quest, however, seems a displacement for brooding over loneliness. Doc says of Susie's profession to be a substitute for love, a kind of lonesome substitute, to which Susie replies, "And what have you got, mister? Bugs? Snakes? Look at this dump. It stinks. You sit here breeding bugs. What do you think that's a substitute for?" Understanding Doc's restlessness as brooding over loneliness instead of brooding over science helps us see the futility of Doc's attempts to rationalize his restlessness through analytical and rational thinking because, to begin with, He's in denial. He does not address his emotions because he knows they can't be explained with logic. When the mystical and religious perspective, which we have seen in the novel Cannery come into play in the novel Sweet Thursday, Doc's problem gets resolved, and the issue of writing a scientific paper becomes secondary. Earlier on, I referred to superstition as an illogical, intuitive way of explaining the world of is in Cannery Row, through which a sense of mysticism is employed, for it correlates with Satori seeing nature as it is instead of trying to analyze its logistics. Though superstition is an explanation, it is not logical. In Sweet Thursday, superstition is one of the elements that leads to the solution for Doc's restlessness. Fauna reads Susie's fortune, finding out Susie will marry a crab, someone born in July. Fauna asks, "Now, you just think, who works with crabs and stuff like that?" Meaning Doc, of course. Further on, she says, if his birthday is in July, he's a gone goose. By coincidence, the fake birthday Doc gives to Mac is July 4th. Susie falls for the superstition. She was limp in the hands of fate. Because of superstition, a step that lacks analyses is taken by the community as a whole to find a solution for Doc's dilemma. While this is not imbued in religion, it is a representation of non-logical thinking, overcoming the desire to understand things in a scientific, analytical, and logical manner. Superstition, as a stand-in for Satori, manages to get Doc closer to a solution to his loneliness. Traces of logic still remain in the community, specifically from Doc's part, that prevent a final resolution to take place. Take the masquerade scene, for example, in which Susie enters dressed as Snow White, after which Doc shook his head to try to wake up. It was a dream, a craziness, the crown, the veil, the virginity. Here Doc is still in denial, unwilling to see Susie as the solution to his problem. His logical attitude leads him to ask, "What the hell is going on?" with which he ruins a great opportunity to solve his loneliness. Again, logic becomes a harm to Doc, for instead of following his emotions and the world which is, he tries to find an explanation, for he dislikes that craziness that the situation radiates. The final solution to the novel involves mysticism and the religious Satori, breakthroughs by both Hazel and Doc. Hazel, whom Margaret C. Roan says fails in conceptual or abstract reasoning, manages to create the solution to Doc's dilemma. The solution is imparted by a mystic man who says to Hazel, "If you love him, you must do anything to help him. Anything, even kill him to save him from incurable pain." Hazel, who again is not capable of reasoning or logical thinking, decides to break Doc's arm so that Susie may carry out her comment of, "If he was in real trouble, like if he was sick or burst his leg, I'd probably take him some soup." It is not a coincidence that the least logical character should be the one to find the solution to Doc's dilemma. Nor is the title of the chapter Lama Sabachthani irrelevant, for the sense of orthodox religion is alluded to while it is soon replaced by the Buddhist Satori. Hazel's vision of a solution is a breakthrough, because he observes the world that is and interprets it without any analytical or logical understanding, yet he manages to understand the situation in an intuitive manner. After Susie says, "I'll go down to La Jolla with you in order to collect the octopi for Doc's scientific quest," we conclude that Hazel's solution worked well. At this point, the relationship between Doc and Susie, which had been postponed, manages to undermine the scientific quest. This, in my opinion, becomes Doc's breakthrough, for no longer does he look for a logical explanation as to the reason for his broken arm, nor to his restlessness. He also accepts the girl, contrary to the masquerade scene. We can conclude his restlessness has been resolved because, contrary to his obsessive impulse to write the scientific paper, now he says, when presented with a telescope instead of a microscope, I guess it doesn't matter whether you look up or down as long as you look. Because his real problem, which was loneliness, is resolved, he no longer has the need to write the scientific paper, nor to be analytical, for he has communed with the cosmic perspective of all and the world that is. Doc's deep struggle to understand the world through logic and his final communion with the naturalistic and Buddhist perspective parallel Ricketts' belief that the greater the struggle, the greater the possible breakthrough. Though a playful novel, departing from the traditional naturalistic and mystic Steinbeck, Sweet Thursday finally is a comment on the importance of seeing the world as it is, a naturalistic world imbued with religious connotations. The artistry in Sweet Thursday starts off attempting to undermine Steinbeck's own unorthodox religious and mysticism, yet purposefully fails in doing so, as observed in the final scene where all Cannery Row was there. The result is a coming together of the community of the novel Cannery Row, which, though missing some members and gaining others, still is.